November 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The air hangs thick with the stench of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and human sweat. Rain has turned the jungle floor into a sucking mire. Beneath a tangle of ferns and shattered palm trunks, a Japanese soldier crouches, barely 40 kilograms, his uniform hanging in tatters, skin stretched taut over jutting bones. His eyes, sunken and fever-bright, scan the perimeter of an abandoned American bivouac. For weeks, his unit has been subsisting on boiled grass, tree bark, and the occasional grub dug from decaying logs. Dysentery racks his gut. His comrades whisper of men who ate their own belts, then their dead friends. He stumbles forward, drawn by the glint of discarded metal. Kicking aside a soaked poncho, he uncovers a dented can. Not ammunition, not medicine. The label is peeling, but the words are clear. U.S. Army, ice cream, vanilla flavor, type B ration supplement. He stares. Ice cream? Here? On this god-forsaken island? His trembling fingers pry at the lid. Inside, a slushy, half-melted mass, already souring in the tropical heat, but unmistakably sweet. He licks it once, then again. A tear cuts through the grime on his cheek, not from the taste alone, but from the unfathomable gulf it reveals. While his emperor's soldiers starve in silence, the Americans bring dessert to war. This moment, small, strange, almost absurd, encapsulates a truth far larger than one can of frozen luxury. It speaks of two nations at war, not just with each other, but with the very limits of survival. And it begins a story of logistics, ideology, and the brutal arithmetic of who gets to eat and who gets to freeze, even in hell. By the summer of 1942, the Empire of Japan stood at the zenith of its territorial conquest. In just 7 months, its forces had swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, each victory more stunning than the last. Tokyo declared this the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a new order, free from Western imperialism, led by Japan's divine mission. But beneath the triumphal headlines, a quiet crisis was unfolding, one not of morale, but of sustenance. Japan had never planned for a prolonged war. Its military doctrine, forged in the swift victories of the Russo-Japanese War and the early campaigns in China, emphasized speed, surprise, and the spiritual superiority of the Yamato warrior. Logistics were an afterthought. Supplies were expected to be seized from the enemy or drawn from conquered lands. Live off the land wasn't just a phrase, it was policy. This mindset proved catastrophic in the vast, roadless jungles of the Pacific. Islands like Guadalcanal had no infrastructure, no surplus food, and hostile terrain. When the U.S. Marines landed on August 7, 1942, to seize the nearly completed Japanese airfield, Tokyo responded with fury, but without foresight. Reinforcements were rushed in piecemeal, often without adequate food, medicine, or ammunition. The Imperial Japanese Navy, struggling to maintain control of the seas, could rarely run the American blockade. What little reached the front lines came on destroyers in night runs dubbed the Tokyo Express, ships designed for speed, not cargo. Troops received rice balls wrapped in seaweed, dried fish, and tins of compressed barley, if they were lucky. By October, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were down to 150 grams of food per day, less than half the minimum needed for survival in a malaria-ridden 35 degrees Celsius environment. Officers burned codebooks and ate tree roots. Men weakened, then collapsed. Diarrhea, beriberi, and dysentery spread like wildfire. Yet surrender was unthinkable. Bushido, the samurai code, demanded endurance unto death. To complain of hunger was to show weakness. So they starved in silence. Meanwhile, across the Lunga River, American Marines, though also battered by disease and combat, ate hot meals. They received canned meat, biscuits, chocolate, and astonishingly, ice cream, not as a luxury, but as standard issue. This disparity was no accident. It was the product of two fundamentally different approaches to war, one rooted in spiritual myth, the other in industrial science. While Japan gambled on willpower, America was mobilizing an unprecedented logistical machine, one that treated soldier nutrition not as a nicety, but as a weapon. And that machine was just getting started. In the United States, war was not just declared, it was engineered. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America's military was ill-prepared for global conflict, but its industrial base was unmatched. Within months, factories that once churned out cars, radios, and refrigerators were retooled to produce tanks, radios, and, crucially, food. Nowhere was this transformation more systematic than in the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, the branch responsible for feeding, clothing, and equipping the fighting man. Led by visionaries like Quartermaster General Edmund B. Gregory, the Corps approached soldier nutrition with scientific rigor. Nutritionists, chemists, psychologists, and engineers collaborated at places like the Army's Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago. Their mission: design rations that were calorie-dense, shelf-stable, transportable, and critically palatable. Morale, they understood, began in the stomach. The result was a tiered ration system: A rations for fresh food in rear areas, B rations of canned and preserved foods for field kitchens, C rations as individual canned meals for combat troops, and K rations as lightweight emergency packs for paratroopers and scouts. But it was the Type B ration that included the item that would stun Japanese soldiers: ice cream. Yes, ice cream. Not as a rare indulgence, but as regular issue. By 1942, the Quartermaster Corps had developed a shelf-stable, freeze-dried ice cream powder that could be reconstituted with water and a dash of refrigeration. Even more remarkably, the Navy and Marines pioneered mobile refrigeration units, refrigerated barges, and field ice cream machines that could churn out gallons of the frozen dessert even on remote Pacific atolls. On Guadalcanal, after the Henderson Field airstrip was secured, Seabees built refrigerated warehouses within weeks. By November, Marines were enjoying ice cream served in mess tents, sometimes with actual spoons. One Marine later recalled officers doling out scoops to boost morale before night patrols. It wasn't just sugar and fat, it was psychological armor. This wasn't decadence, it was doctrine. American military planners had studied World War I and seen how malnutrition sapped fighting strength. They knew that a well-fed soldier healed faster, fought clearer, and resisted despair. So they poured resources into food science with the same intensity they devoted to tanks and bombers. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. produced over 22 billion individual ration meals. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Rail cars groaned under the weight of canned meat and powdered eggs. In stark contrast, Japan's food supply chain remained medieval. Its army requisitioned rice from occupied Korea and China, but transport bottlenecks, corruption, and U.S. submarine warfare strangled distribution. Soldiers often received rations meant for civilians, or none at all. Commanders assumed hardship would purify the spirit. The Americans assumed it would break the body. One side fought with stomachs full of bark, the other with spoons full of ice cream. And that difference would decide more than battles. It would decide who survived. For Private Kenji Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army, Guadalcanal was not a battlefield. It was a slow descent into animal hunger. In his diary, recovered decades later, he wrote, "We boiled our belts. We chewed the bark of banyan trees until our mouths bled. One man ate his dead brother's fingers. No one spoke of it." By November 1942, over 15,000 Japanese soldiers had landed on the island. Fewer than 2,000 would be evacuated alive. Most died not from bullets, but from starvation and disease. American Marines suffered too, Malaria, jungle rot, and constant shelling took their toll. But they rarely went hungry. Corporal James Miller of the 1st Marine Division recalled receiving hot chow twice a day, cigarettes, and sometimes ice cream if the supply plane made it in. Letters home overflowed with mentions of food. "Got peaches and syrup today," one wrote. "Feels like Christmas. This wasn't luck. It was design." U.S. rations averaged 4,000 calories per day, enough to sustain combat exertion in tropical heat. Japanese rations, when delivered, offered barely 1,000. The physical gap was insurmountable. Malnourished Japanese soldiers couldn't dig effective foxholes, carry heavy loads, or stay awake on watch. Their immune systems collapsed. American medics noted that captured Japanese troops often weighed less than 100 pounds. The U.S. didn't just feed its soldiers, it engineered their morale through food science. The development of combat ice cream was a marvel of wartime innovation. Scientists at the Quartermaster Corps discovered that adding glycerin and stabilizers to milk powder allowed it to be reconstituted into a creamy slurry that froze quickly, even in rudimentary field freezers. The Navy took it further. On ships like the USS Cascade, floating refrigeration plants produced up to 500 gallons of ice cream daily. On islands, the Seabees built ice cream barges, converted landing craft fitted with ammonia compression freezers. At Eniwetok, Tarawa, and later Iwo Jima, these units churned out frozen dessert within days of the beachhead being secured. Japan had no equivalent. Its military lacked refrigeration technology for field use. Even basic canning was unreliable. Many tins of meat sent to the front lines spoiled en route. The notion of delivering frozen dessert to a combat zone would have seemed ludicrous to Tokyo's generals. Yet for the Americans, it was not a frivolity. It was a calculated tool of psychological resilience. At the heart of this disparity lay clashing philosophies of warfare. Japanese military doctrine, shaped by the Bushido Code and emperor worship, held that spiritual purity could overcome material weakness. "Victory comes from the spirit," General Hideki Tojo declared. Hunger, pain, and death were tests of character. Complaints were signs of moral failure. In contrast, U.S. doctrine treated the soldier as a human system to be optimized. General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, insisted that morale depended on tangible support: mail from home, clean socks, hot food, and yes, ice cream. He famously said, "Give me logistics over valor any day." This wasn't softness, it was realism. American planners knew that a demoralized, starving army would break, so they fed their troops not just to nourish bodies, but to reinforce a simple message: you matter. Your country has not forgotten you. Japanese soldiers received the opposite message: endure or die. Your life is expendable. And as the war dragged on, that difference became impossible to ignore. Even in the taste of vanilla ice cream found in a rusted can on a ruined beach. In Tokyo, military leadership remained tragically disconnected from the reality on the front lines. Prime Minister and War Minister Hideki Tojo, himself a product of rigid military orthodoxy, dismissed reports of starvation as weakness. When generals requested more supply ships for Guadalcanal, the Navy, already stretched thin, prioritized fuel and ammunition over food. Logistics officers were sidelined. Spiritual exhortations were issued instead. One field commander was reprimanded for focusing too much on rations rather than offensive spirit. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., General George C. Marshall made soldier welfare a strategic priority. He personally reviewed ration compositions and pushed for innovations like the C rations inclusion of cigarettes and chewing gum. Small items with outsized psychological impact. The Quartermaster Corps reported directly to the War Department, ensuring food logistics received the same attention as troop deployments. This top-down commitment meant that even in the chaos of the Pacific, American supply chains adapted. When traditional refrigeration failed, engineers developed dry ice alternatives. When shipping space was tight, nutritionists reformulated meals to maximize calories per cubic inch. Every decision was rooted in the belief that a well-fed soldier was a more effective one. For Japanese soldiers, encountering American abundance was deeply disorienting. Ice cream wasn't just food, it was a symbol of an alien world. Many interpreted it as proof of American decadence. "They bring dessert to war?" one captured soldier reportedly asked in disbelief. "How can such soft men fight so hard?" But others saw something more ominous. In diaries and post-war testimonies, Japanese veterans described a creeping dread. If the Americans could afford to ship ice cream across thousands of miles of ocean, what else could they produce? Tanks? Planes? Ships? The sheer scale of American industrial output became a psychological weapon in itself. U.S. intelligence noted this effect. Psychological warfare units sometimes left candy or cigarettes behind during withdrawals, not just to boost their own morale, but to undermine the enemy's. The message was implicit. We have so much, we can afford to waste it. There is a haunting moral dimension to this contrast. While U.S. Marines debated whether they preferred vanilla or chocolate ice cream, Japanese soldiers on the same island gnawed on boiled grasshoppers. In New Guinea and the Philippines, cases of cannibalism, driven by desperation, not ideology, were later documented by Allied investigators and Japanese historians alike. Was this disparity inevitable, or was it the result of deliberate choices? Japan's leadership chose ideology over compassion. The U.S. chose industrial empathy. Neither side was blameless in the horrors of war, but the treatment of one's own soldiers revealed core values. American abundance did not excuse atrocities committed in the Pacific, such as the mutilation of Japanese corpses or the firebombing of cities. But within their own ranks, the U.S. military demonstrated a rare commitment to preserving not just life, but dignity. Ice cream, in this light, was more than a treat. It was a quiet assertion of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. And as the war turned against Japan, that assertion would echo louder with every abandoned can found in the jungle. The Battle of Guadalcanal, August 1942 to February 1943, was where theory met reality, and the ice cream can became more than a curiosity. It became an omen. When the U.S. 1st Marine Division landed on the morning of August 7, 1942, their primary objective was Henderson Field, a half-finished airstrip that would become the linchpin of Allied control in the southern Solomons. The Japanese, caught off guard, retreated into the jungle, but not before scorching their supply depots. They expected a short campaign. They were wrong. For the next 6 months, Guadalcanal became a meat grinder. But unlike later Pacific battles, it was not just fought with rifles and artillery, it was waged with stomachs. American forces, though initially undersupplied, quickly established a tenuous but functional logistics pipeline. By September, cargo ships braved nightly Japanese naval attacks to deliver everything from ammunition to powdered milk. Refrigerated barges arrived by October. Seabees built ice-making plants using salvaged parts from downed aircraft. By November, Marines were eating hot Thanksgiving meals, turkey, cranberry sauce, and yes, ice cream, under tents strung with mosquito netting. On the other side of the Matanakau River, the Japanese 17th Army starved. General Harukichi Hyakutake, convinced that sheer will could overcome material weakness, launched repeated frontal assaults on Henderson Field. Most famously, in late October. His men, many barely able to stand, charged through American artillery and machine gun fire, with bayonets fixed. They fought with terrifying courage. But courage doesn't fill an empty stomach. Of the 20,000 Japanese troops committed to Guadalcanal, over 14,000 died, most from disease and starvation, not combat. The turning point came in November 1942, after the naval battle of Guadalcanal, where U.S. ships repelled a massive Japanese reinforcement convoy. The Tokyo Express could no longer run reliably. Cut off, the Japanese garrison withered. Soldiers ate snakes, lizards, and roots. Some drank their own urine. Officers executed men caught stealing food. Meanwhile, on the American side, morale held. Not because the fighting was easy. Marines called Guadalcanal the island of death, but because they knew they would be fed, cared for, and if wounded, evacuated. One Marine later said, "When you've got ice cream after a firefight, you start to believe you might actually make it home." The psychological gap widened faster than the physical one. By December, Japanese patrols began finding abandoned U.S. camps, not to raid weapons but to scavenge food. And it was during one such raid that a starving private stumbled upon the can that would haunt him for the rest of his life: U.S. Army ice cream. He didn't understand how it got there. He didn't care. He ate it with his fingers, weeping. And in that moment, the myth of Japanese invincibility began to dissolve, not in a grand battle, but in the quiet shame of hunger. The fall of Guadalcanal in February 1943 marked more than a tactical defeat for Japan. It was the collapse of a worldview. Evacuation orders came in secret. Under cover of darkness, destroyers slipped into the island's bays and pulled out the remnants of the once proud 17th Army. Of the 12,000 men left, fewer than 11,000 were deemed fit enough to board. Many had to be carried, skeletal, delirious, their uniforms hanging like shrouds. They left behind thousands of graves, unburied comrades, and a jungle littered with the detritus of American abundance: empty chocolate wrappers, discarded K-ration boxes, and the occasional rusted ice cream can. For those who survived, the humiliation cut deeper than hunger. They had been trained to believe that spiritual purity made them superior to the soft Americans. Yet here, on this fetid island, it was the Americans who endured, with full bellies, medical care, and even dessert. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. On Tarawa, in November 1943, U.S. Marines stormed the atoll in a brutal 76-hour battle. Despite horrific casualties, nearly 1,000 dead, the supply chain held. Within 48 hours of securing the beach, Navy refrigeration units were producing ice cream on Betio Island. A photo taken on November 24th shows Marines grinning as they eat scoops from mess tins, their uniforms still stained with blood and salt. Meanwhile, the Japanese garrison, nearly 5,000 strong, fought to the last man. Survivors later reported that many defenders had not eaten in 3 days before the invasion. One lieutenant wrote in his final diary entry, "We are ghosts already. The Americans bring ice cream. We bring death." By the time U.S. forces reached the Philippines in 1944 and Okinawa in 1945, the disparity had become grotesque. American soldiers received fresh bread, fruit, and hot meals delivered by landing craft. On Okinawa, ice cream was served not just to troops, but to liberated civilians in refugee camps, a gesture of compassion that doubled as propaganda. Japan, by contrast, had descended into logistical anarchy, with its merchant fleet decimated by U.S. submarines. Over 5 million tons sunk by 1945. Food barely reached the home islands, let alone distant garrisons. On Peleliu, Japanese defenders survived on rainwater and coconut husks for months. On Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi forbade suicide charges, not out of mercy, but because his men were too weak to run. The final symbolic reversal came in August 1945, when U.S. B-29s dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They also dropped millions of leaflets urging surrender. But even before the bombs, American planes had begun dropping food over starving Japanese cities. Operation Blacklist, a humanitarian effort that included canned goods and, yes, powdered ice cream mix. A war that began with Japan's belief in spiritual supremacy ended with its people queuing for American rations. And the soldiers who once found ice cream in a jungle can now watch their children eat food dropped from the sky by the very enemy they were taught to despise. The battlefield had shifted from islands to ideology, and the victor was decided not just by who fired the last bullet, but by who could feed their own. The surrender of Japan on September 2nd, 1945, did not end the suffering, but it did reveal its scale. In the months following VJ Day, Allied occupation forces conducted systematic assessments of former Japanese garrisons. The findings were staggering. On islands like New Britain, Bougainville, and Truk, surviving Japanese troops were often reduced to skeletal figures, many suffering from advanced beriberi, scurvy, and protein deficiency. Autopsies showed stomachs filled with grass, bark, and in some cases, human flesh. A 1946 U.S. Army medical report estimated that over 60% of Japanese combat deaths in the Pacific were due to disease and starvation, not enemy action. By contrast, American casualty reports from the same campaigns showed far lower rates of nutrition-related illness. Even on brutal battlegrounds like Peleliu and Okinawa, where combat stress was extreme, U.S. forces maintained caloric intake, hydration, and medical support. The Quartermaster Corps had succeeded. Food had become a force multiplier. Post-war interrogations of Japanese officers confirmed what frontline diaries had hinted at. The leadership knew supply officers had pleaded for more ships, better rations, and refrigerated transport. But the Army High Command, obsessed with offensive operations and ideological purity, ignored them. One general admitted in a 1947 debriefing, "We believed hunger would make our men harder. Instead, it made them helpless." Meanwhile, the U.S. military institutionalized its wartime food innovations. The freeze-dried ice cream developed for Guadalcanal evolved into the astronaut food of the 1960s. The sea ration gave way to the MRE, meal ready to eat, in the 1980s, still designed with palatability and morale in mind. The lesson was clear: logistics win wars. Japan's post-war reckoning was more painful. Veterans returned to a shattered homeland where food rationing lasted until 1952. Many refused to speak of what they ate or didn't eat in the jungle. The shame of starvation clashed with the myth of the noble warrior. Only decades later did memoirs and historical research break the silence. But the most haunting legacy was psychological. For a generation of Japanese soldiers, the image of that ice cream can, sweet, cold, impossibly American, became a symbol not of decadence, but of a system that valued its people. And that realization was harder to swallow than bark. The logistical chasm exposed on Guadalcanal reshaped military doctrine worldwide. In the United States, the success of the Quartermaster Corps became a cornerstone of Cold War planning. By the Korean War, mobile field kitchens could serve hot meals within hours of a landing. In Vietnam, ice cream was airlifted to fire bases deep in the jungle. The principle remained: a soldier who feels cared for, fights longer, thinks clearer, and returns home steadier. Japan, humbled by defeat, underwent a profound transformation. The Self-Defense Forces, established in 1954, adopted Western logistical models. Nutrition became a priority. Today, Japanese military rations, known as Koryu-ryo, are among the most calorie-dense and culturally tailored in the world, featuring miso soup, rice, and even green tea-flavored energy bars. The old Bushido glorification of suffering was quietly retired, replaced by a pragmatic respect for human limits. Historians now see Guadalcanal not just as the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific, but as the moment industrial civilization proved its superiority over ideological fanaticism. Richard B. Frank, in his definitive history, Guadalcanal, wrote, "The campaign was won not only by courage, but by cargo ships, refrigeration units, and the simple, profound act of feeding one's troops." Even the ice cream itself left a legacy. The U.S. Navy still celebrates ice cream ships. Vessels like the USS Emory S. Land, which produces thousands of gallons weekly for sailors at sea. It's a morale tradition born in the mud of the Solomons. For the men who faced each other across the Matanakaw River, the war's end brought starkly different futures. American veterans returned to GI Bill benefits, homes, and families. Many spoke of the war with pride, but also with gratitude for the system that kept them alive. Japanese survivors often returned to silence. Some never reconciled the dissonance between the empire's promises and the reality of abandonment. One former soldier, interviewed in 1985, said simply, "We were told we were gods. But gods do not eat tree bark while their enemies eat ice cream." The numbers tell one story, the human memory tells another, and both agree, in the calculus of war, sustenance is strategy, and compassion a form of strength. War is often remembered in grand strokes, generals on maps, fleets at sea, cities in ruins. But sometimes its deepest truths are revealed in the smallest details. A dented can of ice cream, half melted in the Guadalcanal heat, was never meant to be a symbol. It was just rations, part of a vast, unsung machine built not to kill, but to sustain. Yet in that can lay the essence of a nation's approach to its sons, not as expendable instruments of glory, but as human beings worthy of care, even in the darkest places on earth. Japan's soldiers were asked to transcend hunger through will. America's were given the means to endure it. One path led to quiet graves in the jungle, the other, home. This contrast was not about morality in the abstract, but about the concrete choices nations make when lives hang in the balance. Industrial might mattered, but so did empathy. Logistics won the war, yes, but it was the belief that every soldier deserved dignity, even a spoonful of sweetness in hell, that made that logistics possible. Today, as conflicts rage across the globe, the lesson endures. War tests not just weapons, but values. And the side that remembers to feed its own, body and spirit, may not always win the battle, but it stands a far better chance of winning the future. In the end, ice cream did not defeat the Empire of Japan, but the world it represented, the world that could spare dessert for its warriors, did. And perhaps, in the silence after the guns fall silent, that is the most human victory of all.